U.S.-Cuba embargo has spanned approximately 5 decades. It has altered the parameters of foreign policy and crippled potential growth for the Cuban economy. Although the events leading up to its establishment justified the need for direct action, the embargo has yet to fulfill its primary purpose of pressuring Cuba to alter their current socialist government structure. In recent years, as the embargo has relaxed, deliberate dialogue between the two countries needs to focus on addressing their differences in the areas of foreign policy and human rights in order to ensure stable relations and economic growth. This topic is significant because the process to restore relations and lift the embargo is ongoing. Therefore, the scope of literature on this particular topic is continuously expanding as progress is being made. As for the purpose of researching this particular topic, a comprehensive analysis of the embargo can determine the development of current reconciliation endeavors, the corresponding influence on the tourism industry, and its likelihood of success. According to Gordon, an embargo is a government mandate that restricts trade of any kind with a specific country. Normally created as a result of tense relations between governments, its purpose is to isolate and control a nation by severely limiting commerce, travel, and economic growth. The following is the organizational framework of the remainder of the presentation. First, we will provide an outline of the embargo's history. Second, we will examine the embargo's parameters and limitations. Next, we will review the political aspects. Then we will explore the restoration of relations between the two countries. Then we will discuss the opportunities and threats to businesses in the tourism industry. After this is discussed, we will provide an analysis of research questions 1 and 2. Finally, we will conclude the presentation and provide a list of references used throughout.
The U.S. embargo on Cuba began when revolutionaries led by Fidel Castro took Havana and overthrew President Batista. The American government accepted Castro, but the relationship changed when he increased its trade relations with the Soviet Union and hiked taxes on U.S. imports. As a result, the U.S. banned nearly all exports to Cuba. Hence in our era. His presidency was from 1953 to 1961. During his presidency, two major things happened. Cuba strengthened its relationship with the major communist state, which was the Soviet Union. This led to a partial trade embargo. The second one was Castro's unwillingness to bow to U.S. demands and his plan to take over U.S. businesses in Cuba. As a result, the planning stages for the Bay of Pigs began. The Bay of Pigs was executed by President Kennedy. His goal was for the CIA to invade Cuba with the help of local residents to overthrow Castro's regime. However, this was unsuccessful, and the CIA was badly exposed and embarrassed. Kennedy's administration era. Cuba's government professed that it's socialist and it affiliates with the Soviet Union. Cuba got expelled from the OAS, which was the Organization of American States. In September 1962, Kennedy expanded the ban to contain all Cuban trade with the exception of medicines and foods. Cuban Missile Crisis. The failure of Bay of Pigs invasion led to a secret agreement to allow the Soviet Union to build missiles on the island. The dispute ended with the U.S. declaring that it would not invade Cuba and it would remove all its missiles in Turkey. The Soviets also agreed that they will destroy all their missile sites in Cuba. Helms-Burton Act. This was to enforce the policies established against Cuba in 1963. It prevented foreign companies from doing businesses in Cuba. President Bill Clinton and Cuba's foreign relationship. In 1996, during President Bill Clinton's presidency, the embargo was strengthened by forming Cuban Liberty and Democratic Solidarity. This was also called Libertad. This act would only be lifted if Cuba holds free and fair elections. President Bill Clinton signed the bill into law because Cuban Air Force shot down the 2 American planes in Florida.
The U.S. embargo is the longest in modern history, with citizens in both America and Cuba feeling the repercussions for over 50 years. The embargo is symbolic of America's attempt to stop Fidel Castro's communist ways in an effort to transform Cuba into a democratic state. Sadly, this has failed. In 1989, the Soviet wanted nothing to do with Castro or Cuba, thus cutting off exports to Cuba. The U.S. reinforced the embargo in 1992 with the Torricelli Law, which created multiple sanctions on foreign relations. It then went further in 1996, creating the Helms-Burton Act, which cut off trade between countries outside of the U.S. From 1989 to 1993, the economy of Cuba dropped 35%. Urban life became a picture of kids with no shoes, prostitution, begging, suicide, and homelessness, due to a lack of stability with jobs, homes, and transportation. Cuba spends about $6 million on transportation alone to get medicine from other countries. Since the start of the embargo, Cuba has acquired about $70 billion of damages. Despite the poor health conditions, Cuba has learned to live by creating substitutes for cropping, delivering babies, medicines, transportation, and even education. Cuba has also developed a biotechnology that no other third world country has ever done. That is not to say it has fulfilled its full potential, and the reason being is because of the embargo and everything that comes along with it.
By analyzing the many different facets of Cuba's established political system, there are two primary deductions that were identified. First, the underlying purpose of the U.S. embargo against Cuba to end the oppressive communist government was unsuccessful. Second, Cuba's long-standing communist political state has stifled the country's economy, restricted individual freedom, and monopolized the tourism industry for financial gain. While there's a need to change the existing embargo and even eliminate it altogether, economic and social success in the country is dependent on a change in the government structure and/or leadership.
Although the Cuba and the U.S. embargo has received global criticism since its inception, the process of reestablishing relations between the conflicting countries has been a primary objective of the Obama administration in recent years. Even though Cuba and the U.S. have nothing in common in areas of human rights and foreign policy, Cowley emphasizes the need to learn to deal with these differences. As the countries began discussing the parameters of their newfound relationship, both countries demonstrated good faith by releasing several political prisoners. Moreover, Obama, to normalize U.S. and Cuba relations, states that family visits and educational activities are permitted under the new administration. In the financial institution sector, Obama will open the importing and exporting channels between the two countries, which will greatly benefit the Cuban banking system. As stated in the article U.S.-Cuba Restore Diplomatic Relations in 2014, the author believes that embargo was and will continue to be a burden to a relationship between Central and South American nations. Therefore, Obama made three major changes: opening an embassy in Havana, reconsidering Cuba's designation as a government sponsor of terrorism, and allowing travel and commerce trade between two countries. After he made his announcement, the president of Cuba, Raul Castro, told his people that Obama's decision is worthy of respect and advises the island to learn the cultural differences between the two nations and adapt accordingly. With the reestablishment of foreign relations between the United States and Cuba, there are several opportunities related to the tourism industry. The first one is foreign investment. According to Jonathan in 2000, Cuba has suffered some major economic recessions since the embargo. He also says Cuba lost approximately 6 billion annual subsidies. However, tourism has successfully saved Cuba's economy by attracting more foreign visitors. The second opportunity is telecommunications. Cuba is a low-income country that has very few telecommunications. Cuba desperately needs telecommunication companies for more opportunities. The third opportunity is airport industry. According to Sullivan, Obama has permitted the United States airports to provide service to Cuba. It is necessary to focus on the airport industry in order to have more visitors and provide convenience for those who travel. The third opportunity is banking. According to Florida Bank's Eye in 2015, the limit in quarterly remittance from Cubans in the U.S. to individuals in their home country has increased from 500 to 2,000. WAC in 2014 states that Banks are less fearful of sanctions violations and are able to open accounts at Cuban financial institutions.
According to Peter Schwab, one reason America has hesitated to lift the embargo is because of the major advancements in Cuban healthcare and medicine, potentially threatening America's economy. Their healthcare, health access, housing, and education are completely free to any citizen in Cuba. Healthcare only makes up 8.6% of GDP in Cuba, compared to 17.9% of GDP in the United States, making it the number one in public health and preventative primary care in the world. Cuba's biotechnology has allowed them to treat leukemia, vitiligo, and perform surgeries related to blindness, which have all been successful. Cuba has a better doctor-patient ratio than America, and 90% of children have immunization coverage. So what about tourism? With an increase of people flying to Havana just to get treatment, in addition to the increase of tourists from all over the world, the weak infrastructure is beginning to affect the increases. It is implied that Cuba could be spending more to advance their tourist industry than profiting from it. Approximately 2 million tourists a year come to Cuba, but as the world advances, it isn't enough for tourists to just have the beach. Tourists crave entertainment and shopping and luxurious hotels, which aren't currently feasible to Cuba. Since America is their cheapest route, the only true way to expand their tourist industry would be with America's support. As Obama has begun lifting the embargo already, the question becomes, if he successfully lifts it, how do Americans deal with it, and what steps do they need to take to be economically beneficial to both Cuba and the United States?
Our first research question is, will the establishment of foreign relations between the US and Cuba provide a positive environment for development in the tourism industry in order to promote economic growth? Now, based on our research, our answer to this is yes, it will. There are risks, however, potential benefits outweighs the possible threats. The embargo placed on Cuba for 50 years was ineffective, and its purpose to impact the government was a failure. Trade between the two countries was disconnected, and the US accumulated a loss of billions of dollars. Now, the major obstacle between the two countries is capitalist versus communist. However, we believe that the relaxation on travel restrictions would significantly grow the tourism industry and increase the country's economic capacities, since Cuba is known for its tropical climate, beautiful beaches, and closeness to Florida.
If the embargo were to lift, the opportunities for the American economy lie mostly in the medical realm and in the tourist industry for Cuba. The potential of Cuban doctors and physicians could advance technology in America, and the hope is that the two countries will collaborate in societies, thereby advancing in technology and expanding communication channels. As for Cuba, tourism currently accounts for 25% of GDP and 40% of exports. Through lifting the embargo, it's estimated that the minimum increase for tourists would rise to 1.8 million people annually. Through the increase of tourism, more revenue would be created, giving the Cuban people a better lifestyle and giving more financial freedom to the state of Cuba. With that, Cuba could build a strong infrastructure and keep up with the technology of today for the tourists and their people. Since America prides itself on human rights for all, it would be hypocritical to keep the embargo the way it is and make Cubans suffer longer than they've had to. In effort to slowly lift the embargo, Americans should anticipate the outcomes that could occur and take into account the ruling of the Castro brothers, but also take into account the Cuban society and what impact this lifting will have on them, as well as the American businesses.
Although Obama announced his desire to ease the restrictions on trade and import, tourism has always been one of the most important and promising industries for the future prosperity and growth of Cuba's economy. Both governments need to address their differences in the areas of human rights and foreign policy. In addition, American government should directly address Cuba's superior medical system and free education. As for citizens of both countries, staying apprised of emerging research and news on this topic will inform those desiring to travel to or conduct business in Cuba, as well as educate individuals on U.S. foreign policy.